Before a single American soldier ever set foot on a battlefield against them, the men of the Wehrmacht already knew exactly who their enemy was. Propaganda films and newspapers had painted the picture clearly and repeatedly. The United States was a decadent nation of jazz bands, Hollywood excess, and greedy capitalists. Its soldiers were factory workers and shop clerks thrown hastily into uniforms, soft, undisciplined, motivated only by paychecks and comfort. They lacked the iron discipline of the German soldier, the racial destiny, the will to sacrifice. When the time came, these amateurs would crumble at the first taste of real war. This belief was not merely encouraged, it was ingrained, repeated in training lectures, whispered in barracks at night, and reinforced by every victory from Poland to France. The first real encounter came in North Africa in late 1942 and early 1943. Operation Torch landed inexperienced American divisions in Morocco and Algeria, far from the main fighting in Egypt and Libya. Veterans of the Africa Corps, men who had marched across the desert under Rommel's command for 2 years, observed the newcomers with a mixture of amusement and contempt. These Americans arrived with brand new equipment, gleaming tanks and trucks that seemed endless, but their movements betrayed inexperience. They advanced cautiously, bunched up on open ground, and relied heavily on artillery preparation that announced their intentions long before the infantry moved. The decisive moment arrived in February 1943 at Kasserine Pass. Rommel, though exhausted and short of supplies, recognized vulnerability and launched a sharp counterattack. Panzer divisions punched through the American lines with textbook precision. German tanks outmaneuvered their opponents, machine gun nests raked exposed infantry, and entire units disintegrated under concentrated fire. Americans abandoned vehicles, weapons, and even personal gear in the rush to retreat. Thousands surrendered in the first days. Captured equipment littered the battlefield. Cases of rations, crates of ammunition, radios still warm. To the German soldiers watching it unfold, the scene confirmed every prejudice. One young panzer commander wrote home that the enemy fought like cowboys in a film, firing wildly in all directions but rarely finding their target. A machine gunner in the 21st Panzer Division noted in his diary how American soldiers failed to dig proper positions and silhouetted themselves against the skyline. In the aftermath, German reports radiated satisfaction. Rommel himself described the American performance as poor, their command indecisive, their troops prone to panic. Prisoners taken at Kasserine often appeared stunned, many admitting they had never expected combat so fierce. In post-war interviews, surviving German officers recalled those days with a lingering sense of superiority. "We broke them completely," one former lieutenant said. "They ran, and they left everything behind. It was exactly as we had been told." Yet even in the flush of victory, small contradictions began to appear. Defeated units did not simply vanish. Scattered American soldiers filtered back to assembly points, reorganized under new officers, and returned to the line within days. Supply columns continued to roll forward despite bombed roads and air attacks. Artillery support, though sometimes inaccurate at first, improved noticeably as observers adjusted fire. One German infantry sergeant wrote in a letter that was later captured, "They lose a battle, and the next day they are back with more tanks than before. Where do they get them all?" As the campaign shifted to Tunisia, the pattern intensified. The Americans, bloodied at Kasserine, did not retreat into permanent disarray. Commanders were relieved. General Lloyd Fredendall replaced by the aggressive George Patton, and tactics changed almost overnight. Infantry began to advance under covering fire more methodically. Tanks learned to support foot soldiers rather than race ahead independently. German defenders noticed the difference immediately. Positions overrun one week faced counterattacks the next, executed with growing competence. A veteran of the 10th Panzer Division recorded in his diary, "The Amis learn quickly. What we taught them at Kasserine, they now use against us." Erwin Rommel, watching from his headquarters, grew increasingly uneasy. In private conversations with his staff, he warned that the Americans possessed resources on a scale Germany could not match. Their ability to replace losses, men, tanks, aircraft, seemed limitless. Publicly, propaganda back home blamed the deteriorating situation on Italian allies and supply shortages, but frontline soldiers knew better. The enemy was adapting faster than expected. By May 1943, the Axis pocket in Tunisia collapsed. over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered, many to American units. In the holding camps, German prisoners had their first extended contact with their captors. The Americans were informal, almost casual. Guards shared cigarettes, offered extra rations, and asked curious questions about life in Germany without hostility. No mass executions, no deliberate starvation, treatment starkly different from what German propaganda had predicted or what many had witnessed on the Eastern Front. One captured officer later recalled in a secretly recorded conversation, "They treated us correctly, even kindly. It was unsettling." Still, most German soldiers clung to their original beliefs. Victory in Tunisia had gone to the Allies through overwhelming material superiority and British leadership, not American fighting spirit. The real war against the Americans would come later, in Europe, where fortified positions and familiar ground would negate their advantages. The image of the soft, breakable enemy remained largely intact. But the cracks were there, visible to those willing to see. In quiet moments under the North African stars, veterans discussed the anomalies. The Americans did not stay routed. They absorbed punishment, adjusted, and returned stronger. Their industry seemed to produce endless replacements. A lieutenant in the Hermann Göring division wrote home in a letter that passed the censors. "They fight with machines more than men. Their artillery never seems to run out of shells." As the survivors of the Africa Corps were shipped into captivity, they carried their certainty with them. The Americans were still amateurs backed by factories, not warriors forged by ideology. The propaganda had been proven right, at least for now. They had expected collapse. Instead, the enemy adjusted. By the summer of 1943, the German soldiers who had survived North Africa carried their experiences home like quiet scars. Those who returned to Europe, reassigned to new divisions or sent to rebuild shattered units, brought stories that did not always match the official narrative. In barracks and officers' messes, the Americans were still dismissed as material-rich amateurs. But the tone had shifted. The easy route at Kasserine was remembered fondly, yet men now added cautious qualifications. They learned quickly. They replaced losses overnight. They did not stay defeated for long. The next major encounter came in July 1943, on the island of Sicily. Operation Husky landed British and American forces on the southern beaches, and once again German units faced the Americans in open combat. The defenders were a mix of veterans pulled from Tunisia and fresh divisions rushed from the mainland. Expectations remained high. Sicily's rugged terrain favored defense, and the panzer divisions stationed there, Hermann Göring and others, were confident they could repeat the successes of North Africa. Initial fighting seemed to confirm this. American troops advancing inland from Gila and Licata met stiff resistance. German counterattacks, led by battle-hardened panzer crews, pushed back the beachheads and inflicted heavy casualties. Tanks of the Hermann Göring division overran positions, scattering infantry and destroying landing craft, still unloading on the shore. Prisoners taken in those first days often appeared shaken, their equipment abandoned in haste. Letters home from German soldiers repeated familiar themes. The enemy was brave, but tactically naive, relying on naval guns and air support rather than skillful maneuver. Yet the pattern from Tunisia repeated itself, only faster. Where German commanders expected the Americans to pause and consolidate after heavy losses, the advance resumed almost immediately. New divisions poured ashore, supported by convoys that seemed impervious to U-boat attacks. General Patton, now in command of the U.S. 7th Army, drove his men forward relentlessly, accepting casualties to maintain momentum. German defenders found themselves yielding ground day after day, not because of direct defeat in battle, but because the pressure never eased. In private diaries and intercepted letters, German soldiers began to express unease. One infantryman in the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division wrote, "We hit them hard at Gela, and they fell back. We thought the beachhead would collapse. Instead, more ships arrived the next morning, and they attacked again as if nothing had happened." Another, a young lieutenant serving as a forward observer, noted the speed of American replacement. "A battalion we destroyed one afternoon was back in the line 2 days later with new men and new guns." Higher up the chain, the tone shifted more noticeably. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, overseeing Axis defenses in Italy, reported to Berlin that American fighting quality was improving rapidly. General Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin, commanding German forces on the island, observed in his post-war writings that the Americans adapted tactics within days, learning to coordinate infantry, tanks, and artillery in ways that had been lacking only weeks before. Even Rommel, though no longer in theater, received reports that troubled him. From his distant headquarters, he warned that underestimating American adaptability would prove dangerous. As Sicily fell in August 1943, the mainland invasion followed swiftly in September. The Salerno landings caught German commanders by surprise, not in location but in execution. The U.S. Fifth Army under Mark Clark came ashore against prepared defenses, and for several days the beachhead hung in peril. German panzer units launched fierce counterattacks, nearly driving the Americans back into the sea. Casualties were severe, and once again prisoners streamed rearward. But the beachhead held. Naval gunfire and air support battered German assembly areas, while fresh troops and supplies continued to flow. When the crisis passed, the Americans did not pause to recover. They pushed inland, linking up with forces from Calabria and beginning the long grind up the Italian peninsula. German soldiers fighting in the mountains south of Rome began to feel the cumulative effect. The enemy opposite them was no longer the hesitant force of Kasserine or even early Sicily. Units rotated regularly, keeping men fresh. Artillery barrages arrived with precision that rivaled German standards. Air attacks disrupted movements by day, forcing German columns to travel only at night. A sergeant in the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division wrote home in late 1943, "We used to laugh at their lack of experience. Now they fight with a confidence we did not expect. Their officers learn from every mistake, and the mistakes grow fewer." Leadership changes in the American ranks accelerated this evolution. Generals who proved too cautious were relieved without hesitation. Aggressive commanders rose quickly. Men like Patton, Bradley, and lower division leaders who emphasized speed and initiative. German intelligence noted the pattern. Defeat or setback led not to retrenchment, but to rapid correction. Doctrine adjusted, training intensified, and the next battle reflected the lessons learned. In the winter fighting around Cassino and the Gustav Line, the transformation became unmistakable. American infantry assaulted fortified positions with determination that surprised veterans of the Eastern Front. When frontal attacks failed, they shifted to flanking maneuvers, infiltration tactics, and combined arms assaults that wore down defenders. Supply shortages plagued the Germans, fuel, ammunition, replacements, but the Americans seemed immune. Trucks rolled forward in endless columns, aircraft dominated the sky, and defeated units reappeared strengthened. Secretly recorded conversations among German prisoners of war, captured during this period and later analyzed by Allied intelligence, reveal the growing disquiet. One captured major from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division admitted, "We were told they would break under sustained pressure. Instead, they absorb it and come back harder. Their material replacement is beyond anything we can imagine." Another officer, speaking privately to fellow prisoners, said, "If this is how they fight after only a year in the war, what will they be like after 2? Back in Germany, propaganda continued to portray the Americans as culturally inferior and militarily crude. Films and newspapers emphasized Italian defeats and British caution, rarely acknowledging American contributions. But frontline soldiers knew better. Letters home, though censored, carried subtle hints of doubt. Words like stubborn and relentless began to replace earlier mockery. Erwin Rommel, now tasked with defending the Atlantic Wall against the expected invasion of France, read the reports from Italy with growing alarm. In conferences with his staff, he spoke openly of the American capacity for rapid improvement. "They do not fight by doctrine alone," he reportedly said. "They fight by results. Every failure teaches them something, and they apply it immediately." His warnings went largely unheeded in Berlin, where optimism about new fortifications and wonder weapons still prevailed. By early 1944, as German armies retreated slowly up the Italian boot, the psychological shift was underway. The Americans were no longer seen as an easy opponent to be crushed in open battle. They were becoming something else, an enemy that learned, adapted, and refused to remain defeated. This was not an army that stayed beaten. June 6, 1944. For the soldiers manning the Atlantic Wall, the day began with the familiar rhythm of coastal defense. Gray dawn, distant naval patrols, the low hum of expectation. They had waited months for this invasion. Fortified bunkers dug deep into cliffs, minefields laid thick along the beaches, machine gun nests positioned to rake any landing force. Propaganda had assured them the Western Allies would come, but that the fortifications, Rommel's asparagus poles, concrete strongpoints, flooded fields, would bleed them dry. The Americans, in particular, were expected to falter on the sand, their morale too fragile for the slaughter of an opposed landing. At first, on some sectors, it seemed the prophecy would hold. At Utah Beach and Point du Hoc, resistance crumbled quickly under naval bombardment. But on one stretch of Normandy coast, codenamed Omaha by the invaders, the fighting unfolded exactly as German defenders had imagined it should. Wide, open beaches offered no cover. Tides and currents scattered landing craft. The 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened unit unexpectedly in the line, poured fire into the approaching Americans from elevated positions. Machine guns swept the waterline, artillery zeroed in on the shingle, mortars blanketed the shallows. Men fell by the hundreds before they reached dry sand. Boats grounded, ramps dropped, and entire platoons were cut down in seconds. From concrete bunkers, German soldiers watched through narrow slits as the assault waves disintegrated. One machine gunner in a Widerstands nest later described the scene in a post-war interview. They came straight at us, wave after wave, like in the training films we had seen. We fired until the barrels glowed. Bodies piled up at the water's edge. Many never left their boats. Officers radioed back triumphant reports. The American landing at Omaha was failing, the beach secured, the invasion contained. For several hours, the defenders believed they were witnessing the collapse they had been promised. Then the tide shifted. Not of the sea, but of the battle. The Americans did not withdraw. Destroyed landing craft were replaced by new ones. Men who reached the shingle dug in under murderous fire, inching forward yard by yard. Naval destroyers steamed dangerously close to shore, dueling bunkers directly. Rangers scaled sheer cliffs thought impregnable. By midday, small groups had breached the defenses at key points. By evening, a lodgment existed. The beach was not cleared, but it was held. Thousands lay dead or wounded on the sand, yet the survivors pushed inland. German soldiers who survived that day carried the memory like a wound. They had inflicted horrific casualties, far beyond what any defender could have hoped, yet the enemy secured the beachhead anyway. A young Obergefreiter from the 352nd wrote in a letter home 3 days later. "We killed them in heaps. It should have been enough to stop any army. But more came, and more still. They did not turn back." In secretly recorded conversations among prisoners taken later in the campaign, veterans of Omaha spoke with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "We thought their morale would break," one said. "Instead, they fought harder the worse it got." In the days that followed, the scale of the invasion revealed itself fully. 5 beachheads linked into one continuous front. Ports were bypassed as artificial harbors, mulberries, rose from the sea. Pipelines snaked under the channel to feed endless fuel. Trucks, tanks, and men poured ashore in numbers that defied comprehension. German reconnaissance aircraft, when they could fly at all, reported columns stretching back to the beaches without end. Allied fighter bombers owned the sky, strafing anything that moved by day. One panzer officer transferred from the Eastern Front confided to his diary, "On the Ostfront we faced masses of men, but poorly equipped. Here it is the opposite. Fewer men at first, but supported by machines beyond counting." Erwin Rommel, touring the front in the invasion's first week, saw the reality clearly. In reports to Berlin and private conversations with subordinates, he abandoned earlier optimism. The fortifications had worked tactically, exacting a terrible price, but strategically they had failed. The Allies were ashore in strength, and their buildup outpaced anything Germany could match. He wrote to his wife on June 16th, "The enemy air force paralyzes all movement. Their artillery is inexhaustible. We are being worn down." His chief of staff later recalled Rommel saying privately, "If we cannot throw them back in the first 48 hours, the war in the West is lost." As the battle moved inland, the psychological pressure mounted. German counterattacks launched with elite panzer divisions achieved local successes, even mauling inexperienced American units. But each thrust was met with immediate response. Artillery concentrations arrived within minutes. J-boats, fighter bombers, swarmed over the battlefield, turning daylight movement into suicide. When German tanks advanced, American tank destroyers and bazooka teams appeared in unexpected strength. Defeated American battalions withdrew, only to return reinforced within days. In the bocaged country beyond the beaches, the fighting became intimate and brutal. Thick hedgerows turned every field into a fortress. German defenders, experts in defensive warfare, ambushed advancing columns, knocked out tanks at close range, and inflicted steady casualties. Yet the Americans adapted again. They improvised, welding prongs to Sherman tanks to breach hedges, coordinating infantry and armor in small, aggressive teams. Engineers cleared paths under fire. Casualties remained high, but progress continued. Soldiers in the line began to feel the weight of relentlessness. There was no pause, no operational lull. Attacks came daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Artillery and air bombardment never ceased entirely. A veteran Feldwebel from the 352nd Division wrote in late June, "We hold a position for days, bleeding them, and then overnight they bring fresh troops and start again. Our men are exhausted. Theirs seem to rotate endlessly." Another, a lieutenant in the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, noted in a captured report, "The American soldier fights stubbornly now. He does not retreat when flanked as he once did. He counters." Higher command struggled to process the change. Reports to OKW spoke of strong enemy pressure, heavy material superiority, complete air inferiority. Words like fanatical and relentless crept into assessments of American infantry. The easy contempt of 1943 was gone. In its place came a grim recognition. This enemy would pay any price in blood to advance, and he could afford it. By late July, the German front in Normandy teetered. The British and Canadians pinned forces around Somme, while the Americans built up quietly in the west. When Operation Cobra unleashed concentrated air power on a narrow sector, the breakthrough came swiftly. Panzer divisions were shattered from the air. The front collapsed. What followed was not pursuit, but encirclement. German soldiers caught in the Falaise pocket experienced the full measure of Allied dominance. Roads clogged with wreckage, skies black with aircraft, artillery walking across the landscape. Escape narrowed to a few corridors, and even those were death traps. Tens of thousands surrendered rather than die uselessly. In the chaos, the question that had been whispered for months now echoed openly. If this was weakness, what did strength look like? We fired until our hands bled. They kept coming. The summer of 1944 gave way to autumn, and with it came the relentless American advance across France. What began as a breakthrough in Normandy transformed into a pursuit that spared no pause. German units, once proud formations with storied names, Lehr, Das Reich, Hitlerjugend, now retreated in disarray, their cohesion fraying under constant pressure. Roads clogged with burned-out vehicles, abandoned guns, and the debris of a defeated army. Soldiers marched on foot, vehicles ran dry of fuel, and the Luftwaffe appeared only in fleeting desperate sorties before vanishing again under swarms of Allied fighters. In the hedgerow country immediately after the Cobra breakout, the fighting remained visceral and close. Thick earthen banks topped with ancient hedges turned every Norman field into a natural fortress. German defenders had used this terrain masterfully in June and July, ambushing tanks in narrow lanes, sniping from concealed positions, and exacting a steady toll on advancing infantry. But by August, the Americans had decoded the puzzle. Engineers welded steel tusks, culled from beach obstacles, to the fronts of Sherman tanks, allowing them to smash through hedgerows rather than expose themselves on roads. Infantry teams learned to advance in bounds, one platoon suppressing while another flanked, mortars smoking out machine gun nests, bazookas hunting panzers at point-blank range. A veteran sergeant from the 9th Infantry Division was quoted by German intelligence as saying his men now treated the bocage like a training ground. From the other side, a German Panzergrenadier in the retreating 116th Panzer Division wrote home in a letter that never reached its destination. "We held them for weeks in these damned hedges, bleeding them white. Now they burst through as if the walls are paper. Their tanks plow straight ahead, and behind them come fresh soldiers who fight like they have studied our every trick. Artillery defined the battlefield more than rifles or tanks. American guns, 105mm howitzers, 155mm long toms, even heavier core artillery, fired in volumes that staggered imagination. Forward observers, often lieutenants or captains pushing far forward with radios, directed fire with a precision that improved daily. Time-on-target barrages arrived without warning. Shells from dozens of batteries landing simultaneously, flattening positions before defenders could duck. One artillery officer in the 12th Army Group later boasted that his unit alone could deliver more shells in an hour than a German division possessed for a week. German soldiers felt it intimately. Bunkers shook, earth erupted, communication lines severed. Survivors emerged dazed, ears ringing, to find the enemy already upon them. Air power compounded the terror. The Jabos, P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons roamed at will. Any movement by day drew attack. Columns learned to disperse into woods, camouflage vehicles with branches, travel only in drizzle or fog. But even then, reconnaissance aircraft circled high, marking targets for later strikes. A driver in a supply column described the routine in a post-war interview. You hear the engines, then the dive. Bombs and rockets, machine guns stitching the ground. You run, you hide, but the next group gets it. We lost more trucks to aircraft than to ground fighting. The tempo was the true killer. German doctrine allowed for operational pauses, time to refit, replenish, counterattack. The Americans granted no such luxury. Armored divisions leapfrogged forward, one exploiting while another refueled, a third mopping up resistance. When fuel shortages briefly slowed Patton's Third Army in late August, Eisenhower shifted priorities, and Bradley's 12th Army Group maintained the pressure. Towns liberated one day became supply hubs the next. Engineers threw bridges across rivers in hours. Rail lines were repaired almost as fast as the advance moved. German commanders watched in mounting despair. Walter Model, sent to stabilize the Western Front, reported to Hitler that the enemy's logistical tail was unbreakable. Convoys rolled night and day, protected by air umbrella. The Red Ball Express, trucks driven by African-American soldiers in endless relays, delivered supplies from Normandy beaches to the front in quantities that mocked German shortages. One quartermaster officer calculated that a single American division consumed more fuel in a day than an entire German panzer corps. In September and October, as the front reached the German border, the fighting shifted to the fortified zones of the West Wall. Here, at last, defenders hoped to halt the tide. Concrete pillboxes, dragon's teeth minefields, remnants of older defenses bolstered by hasty work. In places like Aachen, the first German city to fall, house-to-house combat dragged on for weeks. American infantry, supported by heavy artillery and direct tank fire, cleared block by block. Casualties mounted, but the city fell all the same. Through the autumn rains, the pattern held. Mud bogged vehicles, but American engineers laid corduroy roads and kept traffic moving. Exhaustion gripped German units. Men fought on Benzedrine, rotations impossible, replacements inadequate. Opposite them, fresh divisions arrived continually from the United States. The 104th Timberwolves, the 99th Checkertail, others untouched by earlier campaigns. A captured German major from the 7th Army admitted in interrogation, "Your soldiers rotate out when tired. Ours fight until dead or wounded. How can we match that?" Higher command grappled with the implications. Rundstedt and Model pleaded for withdrawal to shorter lines, preservation of forces for later counteroffensives. Hitler refused, demanding every meter held. Secret staff discussions, later revealed in post-war testimonies, turned bleak. Officers spoke openly of material inferiority, not just in quantity, but in sustainability. The American Army did not need brilliance when it possessed inexhaustible depth. Mistakes were corrected instantly, losses replaced before impact registered. Among the Lancers in the foxholes, respect edged into something closer to fatalism. The American soldier was still seen as less fanatical, less willing to die uselessly than his Soviet counterpart. But the system he served, the endless trucks, the all-seeing aircraft, the shells that never ran out, operated with a cold, mechanical inevitability. One young lieutenant wrote in his final diary entry before the Hürtgen Forest, "We fight men, but we are losing to machines. Their war production works while ours burns under bombers. Their men learn and adapt while ours grow fewer and older. By December 1944, as snow began to fall along the frontier, the German front held only by thread. Preparations for one last gamble stirred in secret. The Ardennes offensive. Veterans sensed it coming, hoped for miracle. But in their quieter moments, they understood the deeper truth. The enemy across the lines was no longer the soft amateur of propaganda reels. He was a force that absorbed every blow, adjusted to every tactic, and advanced without need for rest or respite. This was no longer a contest, it was attrition with momentum. December 16, 1944. Dawn broke cold and gray over the Ardennes forests, where snow dusted the pine needles and mist clung to the river valleys. For the men of the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies, it was the hour of the great gamble. Operation Walk am Rhein, Hitler's desperate bid to split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. Intelligence had reported American lines thin, troops complacent after months of pursuit. German soldiers, many pulled from the Eastern Front or rebuilt from Normandy's wreckage, whispered of a chance to turn the tide. Propaganda promised a repeat of 1940. Panzers through the Ardennes, surprise and speed, overwhelming a foe lulled by easy victories. The Americans, they were told once more, would shatter under the shock. The attack erupted with artillery crashing through the fog, SS Panzers surging forward on roads choked with snow. Initial hours brought the success commanders had dreamed of. American outposts crumbled. Green divisions like the 106th Infantry buckled under the onslaught. Bastogne, a vital crossroads, fell into German hands briefly, only to be retaken by hasty counterattacks. Prisoners streamed rearward, equipment captured in the confusion. In command posts, radios crackled with reports of breakthroughs. The Meuse River within reach, enemy morale cracking. One Panzer lieutenant, advancing through the lines of the 28th Infantry Division, wrote later, "They fought scattered, without their usual fire support. We overran them as in the old days, and for a moment, I believed we could win." But the Ardennes, that same wooded maze where the Wehrmacht had triumphed 4 years earlier, now worked against its masters. American resistance, though surprised, did not dissolve. Isolated units held roadblocks with rifles and machine guns, buying time for reinforcements. Artillery, though disrupted, responded when lines stabilized. And above all, the air, grounded by weather in the first days, loomed as a threat. German soldiers pushing forward felt the old unease return. Supply lines stretched thin over icy roads, fuel rationed to the drop. Panzers idled, waiting for promised logistics that never fully arrived. By December 19th, the offensive stalled at the Elsenborn Ridge and around Bastogne. Here, the 101st Airborne Division, trucked in from reserve without winter gear, dug into the snow and refused to yield. German assaults battered the town repeatedly. Infantry waves under heavy fire, panzers probing for weak points. Each attack gained ground at appalling cost, only to face counter-battery fire that silenced guns and shredded advances. A Fallschirmjäger captain, leading one such assault, recalled in a post-war interview, "We expected them to break as any normal troops would after days without relief. Instead, they held with a stubbornness that bordered on madness. Their artillery never missed, their small arms never stopped." The moment that crystallized the shift came on December 22nd, when the German commander at Bastogne, General Heinrich von Leutwitz, sent a formal demand for surrender under a flag of truce. The American reply, scrawled by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, arrived terse and defiant. "Nuts." The word echoed through German forward positions like a slap. Officers read it aloud in stunned silence, then with bitter laughter. One staff officer later said it captured everything. Not arrogance, but a casual certainty that the siege was temporary, the outcome inevitable. In the ranks, the story spread quickly, whispered around frozen foxholes, debated over meager rations. "Nuts," a machine gunner muttered to his comrade. "That is what they think of us now." As skies cleared on December 23rd, the full weight of American response descended. Waves of B-26 Marauders and P-47s hammered German columns, turning roads into charnel houses. Fuel dumps exploded, panzer parks burned, infantry columns scattered into the woods. The Luftwaffe's desperate Me-109 sorties achieved little against overwhelming numbers. Ground forces, sensing the trap closing, began to waver. Encirclements formed around St. Vith and elsewhere, pockets of resistance surrendering by the thousands. The offensive, which had promised miracle, ground to a halt in deep snow, its momentum spent not by grand counteroffensive, but by the quiet hardening of lines. In those final days of the Bulge, German soldiers confronted the irreversible truth. The Americans could be surprised, as at dawn on the 16th. They could be hurt, as in the foxholes around the Our River. But they could not be broken. Reinforcements arrived in endless streams, divisions from England, fresh troops from ports still unloading. The system that had carried them across France now repaired the breach with mechanical efficiency. A captured SS officer, speaking in a recorded POW session, admitted, "By late January 1945, the front lines returned roughly to where they had been, but the psychological damage lingered. The Ardennes marked the end of any illusion of parity. German units withdrew into the Reich's defenses, Rhine bridges mined, cities fortified, the Volksturm mobilized with rifles and pitchforks. Yet morale, already frayed, cracked further. Desertions increased, not from cowardice but from recognition of futility. Letters home, intercepted by censors, carried tones of resignation. The Amis will come, and when they do, we will not stop them." The collapse accelerated in the spring. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine, first at Remagen, then in force elsewhere, resistance fragmented. Cities fell after brief, savage street fighting, but organized defense dissolved into chaos. By April, with Soviet forces closing from the east, mass surrenders became the norm. In the Ruhr pocket, over 300,000 German troops laid down arms to the Americans, preferring the uncertainty of Western captivity to the known horrors of the Red Army. One Wehrmacht general, surrendering his corps, reportedly told his captors, "We fight no more. Your war is won." For the prisoners, the experience shattered remaining myths. Shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty ships to camps in Oklahoma, Texas, Wisconsin, far from the front, the journey itself was a revelation. No brutality, no starvation marches. Guards were firm but fair, rations adequate, medical care prompt. In the camps, German POWs worked on farms, in factories, even attended classes on democracy and the camp's liberation. American civilians visited, curious but without hatred, offering baseball gloves and records of swing music. One former Panzer crewman, interviewed decades later, said, "We expected revenge for what we had done. Instead, they gave us cigarettes and asked about our families. It was the first time I saw the men behind the machines." Secretly recorded conversations in these camps captured the raw processing of defeat. Groups of officers and men, thinking themselves private, dissected the war's illusions. "We called them soft," one major said, "but they endured Omaha, the hedgerows, the Bulge. Their softness was in mercy, not in fight." A young conscript added, "Propaganda said they lacked will, but they crossed an ocean to fight us, then treated us as humans when we lost. What does that say about us?" Themes emerged repeatedly: respect for American adaptability, awe at their resources, quiet shame at the propaganda that had blinded them. Post-war, the reflections deepened. In the 1950s and 1960s, as Germany rebuilt, veterans gathered in veterans' halls or wrote memoirs. Men who had once sneered at Yankee amateurs now spoke of them as worthy foes. Erwin Rommel's aides, surviving the July plot, published accounts emphasizing his early warnings about American potential. Former enemies met at reunions, Normandy beaches, Ardennes crossroads, sharing stories over beer, no longer as victors and vanquished but as survivors. A German colonel and an American major, both wounded at Bastogne, clasped hands in 1964. "You said nuts," the German joked. "We heard it loud and clear." The war ended not with a clash of ideals, but with the quiet admission of reality. Propaganda had built a fortress of certainty. The evidence of endless trucks, unyielding lines, and offered cigarettes tore it down. German soldiers, raised on superiority, learned that the most dangerous enemy is the one you dismiss, the one who learns, adapts, and forgives. They were not what we were told, and by the time we understood, the war was already lost. Subscribe for more World War II stories told from the inside.